the brutal winter of 1867, Foreman Samuel Hartwell sent his final telegraph from Union Pacific's remote Camp 17 in Utah's Wasatch Mountains. It contained only 7 chilling words. Supply shortages critical. Men eating each other. 3 days later, a rescue team fought through 12 feet of snow and found the camp eerily alive. Cook fires still burned iron cauldrons, steamed with stew. But of 127 men, only 18 remained silent and wide-eyed in the supply shed, refusing to say what had kept them alive. The railroad sealed all records, and for over a century, families were told their loved ones had wandered into the wilderness. Newly unearthed company correspondence, however, exposes a horror carefully hidden, one that redefines the dark cost of America's westward expansion. Camp 17 established that September stood as both a symbol of ambition and a crucible of human desperation. It was built in a hostile valley between 8,000-foot peaks, chosen not for survival, but for the railroad's relentless drive to beat the Central Pacific and claim the $48,000 per mile offered for mountain track, nearly triple the plains rate. Irish immigrants, scarred Civil War veterans, and freedmen worked side by side for wages that often never came, hammering rails and blasting granite while living in canvas tents and rough barracks under constant avalanches of dynamite and snow. At their head was Hartwell, a 43-year-old former Union quartermaster whose sharp discipline kept chaos at bay, and beside him, his massive assistant foreman, Thomas Kincaid, a Dublin-born giant who ruled the camp with a sledgehammer in one hand and a peacemaker's touch in the other. Even the cook, Wilhelm Brenner, a German veteran with an unnerving butcher's gaze, ran his kitchen with a soldier's precision. By October, supply trains that should have arrived weekly came sporadically, sometimes weeks late and half empty. Funds meant for provisions were quietly siphoned off by Union Pacific executives eager to appease investors, leaving Camp 17 starving in the mountains. Telegraphed pleas for help were met with vague assurances about temporary delays, and as the snow deepened, desperation began to devour the camp from the inside. What the rescue party found in those cauldrons was only the beginning of the story. As the Utah winter closed in, the railroad executives in Omaha acted as though the starving men of Camp 17 were spoiled for expecting regular food. Supplies dwindled, and the crew turned to hunting, but months of blasting had driven away every deer and elk. By November, the rations shrank from 3 meals to 2, then one with nothing to eat but pine needles and bitter herbs. Hunger hollowed them out, turning good-natured men into rivals. Around the cook fires, where songs once echoed silence, settled broken only by arguments over scraps. And still the company's telegrams demanded full quotas, as if from another planet, blind to the frozen hell these men endured. Tools froze to their hands, their breath turned to ice, and malnutrition sapped their strength. Then came November 23rd, 1867. A blast that should have opened the mountain instead buried Patrick Sullivan, the 24-year-old Irishman whose jokes once held the camp together. The fuse burned wrong, or the powder was tainted, and tons of granite came crashing down. For an hour his cries bled through the valley until silence took him. When they dug him out, his body was pulverized, his face erased. The men stood in stunned quiet, discussing how to bury him in the frozen ground, when Wilhelm Brenner, the camp cook, stepped forward. His pale eyes studied the wreckage with the detached focus of a butcher examining a carcass. He knelt, tested the body with his calloused hands, and finally said, his German accent slicing the cold, "There's still good meat here. Waste not, want not. That's what we learned at Vicksburg." The workers froze, staring as he drew his knife and began to separate the flesh from the shattered bones with methodical care. This boy gave his life for the railroad. Brenner went on, his voice as calm as if explaining a recipe. Least we can do is not feed him to the wolves. Thomas Kincaid's voice shook as he said what they were all thinking. Jesus Christ, Wilhelm, you can't be serious. But Brenner never looked up. I've served horse to cavalry, rat stew to siege survivors, boiled leather to starving men. This is fresher than anything we've eaten in weeks. Patrick took care of himself. He'll keep us alive. He worked as if the decision had already been made, forcing Samuel Hartwell to confront the hardest choice of his life: stop the madness and let his men starve or cross a line no one could ever come back from. Hartwell knew their last supply train was now 3 weeks overdue. What little food remained might last 10 more days at best, and telegraph operators passing through the foothills warned that the mountain passes would likely stay blocked until April. The company had abandoned them, leaving 126 men to starve while winter clamped its fist around Camp 17. Standing over the crushed remains of Patrick Sullivan, Hartwell felt the weight of command as never before. Every eye in the camp was fixed on him, waiting for the choice that would either preserve their humanity or ensure their survival. Snow began to fall, drifting in slow, heavy flakes, until Sullivan's blood was nearly hidden beneath white powder. After what felt like hours of silence, Hartwell gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Brenner's pale eyes sharpened, and with the focus of a surgeon, he went back to work. Within 2 hours, pieces of Sullivan had been diced into the evening stew, blended with the last potatoes and onions. Brenner spiced and cut the meat small enough that in the flickering firelight, it looked like game. Many men stared at their bowls, unable to take the first bite. But by morning, every dish was empty, and a few even asked Brenner quietly if he had more of the same. That night the camp lay awake, listening to the sounds from the cook tent, the dull rhythm of a cleaver, the scrape of steel on bone, the occasional splash of water as Brenner cleaned his tools, and the eerie softness of him humming German lullabies while the fires hissed. By dawn, their porridge came with what Brenner called mountain sausage links, seasoned so cleverly that no one could guess what they contained, only that it was the most satisfying thing they had eaten in months. Something changed after that meal. The hunger that had consumed them seemed to lift. Even in the biting cold, the men felt stronger, clearer, and for the first time in weeks, capable of work. And Brenner, once just the camp cook, became something more, part savior, part judge. They started going to him with problems that had nothing to do with food, listening to his advice like it came from a priest or a general. He'd just smile, tap his temple, and repeat his mantra, waste not, want not. There's always more if you know where to look. On December 7th, Marcus Holloway collapsed while hauling timber, a sudden heart attack dropping him where he stood. Unlike Sullivan's violent death, this one was quiet, almost merciful. Holloway's passing left the camp without one of its most reliable veterans, a man whose knowledge had guided them through countless technical challenges. But this time there was no debate. No one spoke of burial or waiting for spring. Brenner already had his knives ready. Several men even helped carry the body to his tent, without being asked, like following an unspoken routine. Marcus was a good man, Brenner said, as he prepared his knives. He'll keep helping us now in the only way he can. His hands moved faster now, confident from practice carving, with a brutal artistry that horrified and mesmerized the crew in equal measure. What had taken Brenner hours to salvage from Sullivan's mangled body took barely 1 hour with Holloway's intact corpse, and the results were disturbingly better. His efficiency had sharpened with practice. Every cut cleaner, every part of the body, used nothing wasted. He had learned how to extract the maximum from every victim, turning even organs into something unrecognizable, once disguised with onions and wild herbs. As his skill grew, so did the men's appetite. By now the crew no longer forced themselves to eat from necessity. They devoured the evening stew with genuine hunger, praising Brenner's seasoning and asking for more. What had begun as a horror was now spoken of in veiled compliments, the language of men who pretended their food came from anywhere but their own companions. And Hartwell, even as he accepted the benefits of his own fateful decision, began to see patterns that chilled him. Death now came with a rhythm. Every 10 to 12 days, just as their rations began to thin and hunger returned, another man fell. After each death, the crew's strength and cheerfulness rose again. The change in their behavior was even worse. Around the fires and on the work lines, conversations had turned sharp and guarded. Once brothers in hardship, the men now studied each other like hunters, weighing who was useful, who was weak, who might be next. When Seamus O'Brien died on December 19th, all pretense of accident evaporated. A strong, healthy Irishman of 28, he was found at the base of a granite outcrop skull, crushed. Officially, he had slipped on ice while hauling blasting powder. But the scene told another story. Thomas Quincaid examined the site and found no sign of a fall. No disturbed ice, no scatter of powder, only blood sprayed in a pattern that made it clear the killing blows had been delivered while O'Brien lay on the ground. It was murder pure and simple. When Quincaid brought his findings to Hartwell, the foreman didn't hesitate. "Keep it to yourself," he ordered. "Help Brenner prepare the meal." With those few words, the last barrier between survival and savagery collapsed. From that moment, Camp 17 crossed a line they would never return from. That night, the stew tasted richer than ever, and the men gathered around the fires with a hungry anticipation that had nothing to do with the cold. The realization settled like ice in the few who still clung to their consciences. This was no longer desperation. It was a system. They had become killers, their own survival chained to a schedule of blood. By the time December bled into January, the camp was locked in a grim cycle. Out of the original 124 men, remained their lives ruled by a new order. Hartwell, the commander, Quincaid, the enforcer, and Brenner, whose power had grown beyond food to something far more primal. Every 10 days, Brenner would appear at breakfast with his nutrition assessment clipboard in hand, his pale eyes moving from man to man as he made notes. He studied their bodies for weakness, their output for usefulness, and most chillingly, the strength of their friendships, as though already deciding who the next meal would be. By January, the system had become refined to a quiet, deliberate art. Men who kept to themselves, men with no allies or who showed even the faintest signs of weakness, always seemed to be assigned to the most perilous jobs. On paper, the duties looked fair, handling unstable dynamite that demanded steady hands, venturing alone into half-dug tunnels ready to collapse, or surveying the cliffs where one false step meant a fatal fall. But to anyone who paid attention, the pattern was unmistakable. These tasks were not distributed at random. They were a culling way of eliminating those whose deaths would provoke the least resistance and cause the smallest disruption to the grim equilibrium of Camp 17. When 23-year-old Friedrich Köhler, a German immigrant who barely spoke English, was found at the bottom of a ravine on January 2nd, the camp treated it as just another tragic accident. His isolation, kept at arm's length by language and culture, had made him a perfect target. Brenner arrived, as he always did, wordless and precise, unpacking his knives with the same calm ritual as a surgeon preparing for an operation. By now, his presence at every fatal accident was as expected as a doctor answering a call. No one questioned why he was there. No one interfered. What was happening to the camp went deeper than flesh and hunger. It was a slow, almost invisible hollowing out of the men themselves. Where once they had passed letters around the fire and swapped stories of their homes, the evenings were now silent. The fires burned the bowls, passed from hand to hand, and the men ate like livestock. Conversation narrowed to schedules, tools, and quotas stripped of all warmth. Every man had learned to watch his back, measure his own usefulness, and say nothing that might mark him as expendable. Trust had died long before many of them did. Thomas Quincaid embraced his new role with an ease that surprised even Hartwell. Where Hartwell saw the selection process as a grim necessity, Quincaid took to it like a predator, learning the habits of its prey. When Daniel McCarthy, a young Irishman, began to falter in mid-January, the tall Dublin-born foreman suddenly took him under his wing. He carried McCarthy's heavier loads, offered him bread, even laughed with him by the fire. 3 days later, McCarthy was crushed under a pile of logs that slipped during transport. Quincaid was of course on hand to pull the body out and swear to the tragic accident. The timing was perfect. The camp's special rations were running low, hunger gnawed again, and McCarthy's body replenished them. Even Dr. Edwin Cartwright, the camp's physician, who at first had tried to record the mounting evidence of murder, eventually broke. His meticulous notes of blood patterns, inconsistent wounds, and impossible explanations had been his act of resistance. But by late January, even that resistance collapsed. Starvation and isolation stripped him down to the same brutal calculus as the rest. When Giuseppe Bellacorte's body came in on January 24th, crushed and broken in ways that didn't match the story he'd been told, Cartwright examined the corpse, noted the irregularities, then quietly closed his notebook. Survival had silenced him. Cartwright logged death by misadventure and without a word helped Brenner carry the corpse to the cook tent. That moment marked the final collapse of resistance in Camp 17. By February, what had once seemed unthinkable now passed for ordinary. Cannibalism had become a way of life, and the rituals around it as commonplace as the morning roll call. Men who only weeks before had been sickened at the idea of eating human flesh now crowded eagerly around the fires, praising Brenner's inventiveness, requesting specific cuts and preparations as though they were dining in a fine house instead of an outpost of the damned. Brenner had developed a frightening artistry. He seasoned, smoked, salted, and mixed herbs scavenged from the frozen valley into dishes that masked the origin of the meat so completely that the camp had come to look forward to meals. His food was no longer just sustenance, it was comfort, prestige, even pleasure. Around the fires, men vied for his approval, offering suggestions for new recipes and congratulating him on meals that just months before would have horrified them. The first fracture in this grotesque new normal came in early February, when a Polish immigrant, Kazimierz Kowalski, made a discovery that would eventually record the full horror of what had unfolded in Camp 17. A former university student, educated and observant Kowalski, had come west to escape political turmoil in his homeland. Searching through an old abandoned supply shed for salvageable materials, he pulled up a set of loose floorboards and uncovered a hidden graveyard of belongings. Watches, wedding rings, photographs, and letters from men who had supposedly deserted or died in accidents. And beneath it all, in a battered ledger, lay Brenner's private records. The cook had cataloged everything, with the cold precision of a scientist, each victim's height, weight, body composition, estimated yield, and notes on which cooking methods produced the best results. The ledger read like a butcher's manual for human flesh. Horrified but methodical, Kowalski began a secret journal of his own. Writing in a mix of Polish and English, he documented every killing, every meal. Every night, the cleaver thudded in Brenner's tent. His diary became a chronicle of their descent. February 8th, they took Michelson today. The poor Swedish boy never had a chance once Kincaid marked him. Found him this morning with his skull crushed, same as the others. Brenner was sharpening his knives before the body was cold. We will eat well tonight. Tomorrow the cycle begins again. Kowalski's search revealed more than personal effects. Among Hartwell's papers, he found letters to railroad executives that painted a picture of deliberate deception. Hartwell was reporting that the missing men had deserted, concealing the truth, so the company would face no liability. Even worse, some of the correspondents hinted that the company had known all along what was happening. Early letters spoke vaguely of alternate food sources and creative resource management in a way that read now made their complicity unmistakable. Better, it seemed, to let the camp cannibalize itself than risk the expense and scandal of a rescue mission. By February, the remaining 87 men had split into two worlds. In the inner circle were Hartwell, Kincaid, Brenner, and their loyalists who discussed victim selection openly and tracked the camp's food supply with charts and schedules. In the outer circle were those who understood perfectly well what was happening, but who had no power to stop it living each day like hunted animals. Among the inner circle, cannibalism had evolved beyond necessity. It was now doctrine. They spoke of natural selection and improving the workforce, justifying their crimes with a philosophy of social Darwinism. In Hartwell's quarters at night, over firelight and the reek of tallow, they discussed their project in the language of science. Brenner, drawing on his scraps of European education, gave cold lectures on physiology and nutrition. insisting that human flesh gave them better strength than ordinary rations, that eating the weak made the strong invincible. "Each man we process makes us harder, more resilient," he said to the rapt faces of the inner circle. "We are becoming something beyond ordinary men. Civilization died here with the snow. We have become evolution." Detailed records were kept, charts of which cuts yielded the most strength, notes on the taste and effect of every victim. Brenner experimented with smoking and salting the flesh, creating a reserve that allowed them to stretch the time between kills to vary their menu. Meanwhile, the outer circle lived under constant, crushing terror, knowing that any weakness, fatigue, injury, even solitude was enough to mark them as the next accident. The cleaver's rhythm at night became their countdown. By February, paranoia had become the lifeblood of Camp 17. Men no longer slept soundly. They slept in shifts, each choosing a companion to watch over him through the night, because to sleep unguarded was to risk never waking up. Some tried to form alliances for protection, but the brutal arithmetic of survival tore those bonds apart. Any group strong enough to resist Hartwell's inner circle was also large enough to threaten the food supply, and in Camp 17, that was a death sentence. Cooperation meant starvation, resistance meant execution. The breaking point came on February 14th. Brian Donnelly, an Irish worker whose anger had survived longer than most men's morals, finally snapped, calling Hartwell's inner circle murdering bastards who've turned us into monsters worse than wolves. He gathered 12 others, men who still remembered who they had been before the hunger hollowed them out. Their plan was desperate: seize weapons, overthrow Hartwell, and either break free through the passes or at least create a system of survival that did not rely on butchery. For weeks, they stockpiled tools and food in secret. But secrets were impossible in Camp 17. Brenner's network of loyal informants betrayed them. Just before dawn, when most of the camp was asleep, Kincaid led the counterstrike. He claimed later they had been forced to defend themselves, but what followed was no brawl. It was an execution. The inner circle moved like soldiers, fast and merciless. When it was over, Donnelly and 4 of his men lay dead, their wounds telling the story of deliberate slaughter. The others were dragged before Hartwell and offered a choice: join the inner circle as active participants or be processed for the next meal. 7 surrendered. Only 1 man refused, Kazimierz Kowalski. Too valuable as a chronicler to kill, Kowalski was allowed to live. But even he was forced to eat his pen, becoming the last witness in a world that no longer recognized conscience. Kowalski's journal, recovered decades later among his grandson's belongings, provides the clearest record of Camp 17's final descent, a society that abandoned every pretense of morality and reorganized itself around the efficient production and consumption of human flesh. In his pages, the boundary between man and meat disappears. What was once survival had hardened into routine. The massacre of Donnelly's rebellion cemented the inner circle's control. That very night, they introduced the roster, a written schedule of death that extended through the remainder of the winter, managed with the same meticulous discipline Hartwell once applied to railroad construction. Every man knew his rank. Those at the bottom would be consumed soon. Those at the top bought themselves a little time by helping enforce the rules. The effect was shattering. Friendships died. Conversation became calculation. Everyone looked at everyone else as a meal. Brenner's cook tent had become a slaughterhouse. By mid-February, it rivaled a professional abattoir in organization. Specialized tools hung from the walls. Cuts of flesh were categorized, salted, smoked, and cataloged with a system so precise it bordered on the scientific. Brenner had turned murder into research, experimenting on the nutritional value of organs, on which body parts gave the most energy, even whether consuming certain flesh improved strength or focus. Younger victims were tender and needed little spice. Older men were tough. Slow cooking and heavy herbs hid the taste. Every note went into his journal like data in a lab book. The constant smell of cooking drew predators from miles away. Wolves and bears haunted the camp's edges, emboldened by the scent circling the valley, where the scraps of men were dumped. Nature itself seemed to warp around the crimes of Camp 17, the predators fattening on what the cannibals left behind. All the while, Hartwell sent calm, measured telegrams to Union Pacific headquarters. He wrote of desertions, progress, and stable conditions fabrications that concealed the nightmare. And if some company officials suspected what was really happening in that mountain camp, they chose silence. It was cheaper to let 127 men devour each other than to launch a rescue that might expose the truth. Corporate correspondence later revealed that Union Pacific executives had long been aware something was wrong at Camp 17. They referred in bloodless language to alternative resource management and creative problem solving. Under adverse conditions, phrases that amounted to permission as long as the atrocities never became public and the railroad's expansion stayed on schedule. Inside the camp, Hartwell had turned fear into a system. Rewards replaced morality. Men who proved their loyalty to the inner circle, who showed eagerness to enforce the new order, were given larger food portions, better sleeping quarters, and most importantly, a reprieve from the roster. Anyone who hesitated, who showed shame or doubt, found themselves isolated, friendless, and marked. Survival now meant not only eating human flesh, but praising it. By early March, the last fragile remnants of civilization collapsed. On March 3, 1868, a supply train finally appeared on the horizon, crawling through the mountain passes with the food and materials that, if delivered months earlier, could have saved dozens of lives. The sight should have been salvation. Instead, it threw Camp 17 into chaos. For Hartwell and his followers, the train wasn't a lifeline, it was a death sentence. Within hours outside, eyes would see everything: the racks of smoked and salted human flesh hanging in Brenner's tent, the population reduced from 127 to barely 40. The haunted faces of the survivors who had been shaped into something less than human. No telegram could explain that away. No one would believe these were just accidents. Hartwell called an emergency meeting. The supply problem, as he called it, had to be solved before the train reached camp. Brenner, as always, offered the most direct solution. His pale blue eyes scanned the room as he said with a butcher's calm, "We remove every witness. When the train arrives, we tell them the others deserted or froze. The mountains kill many. No one will question it if we all say the same thing." The logic was terrifying and unassailable. 30 more bodies killed before dawn. Then nothing left to expose them. It was a plan that required every man in the inner circle to become a murderer, implicating them all. So deeply, there could be no turning back. Hartwell gave them no illusions. Either we do this together or we hang together. There is no other way. At first light on March 5th, with the train less than a day away, Camp 17 erupted in silent slaughter. The killers moved through the sleeping barracks like a wave, using axes, hammers, picks, anything heavy enough to crush a skull quickly. Men barely woke before they were struck. There was no time for screams, no struggle, just the wet sounds of murder in the dark. By the time the sun crested the peaks, the valley was silent again. But the snow around the barracks was soaked through with blood. The slaughter was over in less than an hour. Starved and half-mad, the victims had no strength to fight. Months of malnutrition and terror had left them defenseless against the men who had fed on human flesh and grown stronger. What followed was recorded in Kazimierz Kowalski's diary, a last eyewitness account of Camp 17's descent into hell. "The screaming began just after sunrise," he wrote. "It echoed off the mountains like the cries of the damned. I heard Brenner shouting over the chaos, ordering his men to work quickly to leave no witnesses. From my hiding place behind the supply shed, I saw them dragging bodies toward the fires. They were not preparing food this time. They were destroying evidence. The plan was simple. Burn everything that could reveal their crimes, then present themselves as heroic survivors of a winter that had wiped out their less fortunate companions. Accidents, disease, desertion, avalanches, those would be the causes of death. No mention of the truth. But there were too many bodies. Even Breener's ruthless efficiency could not erase an entire season of slaughter in a few hours. valley itself betrayed them piles of bones, racks of smoked flesh, the stink of human fat baked into the snow. As the whistle of the approaching train echoed up the pass, panic set in. They would never erase it all in time. So they settled on one final lie, desperate and calculated. When the supply train arrived, they would say that Camp 17 had been attacked by hostile Indians. The raiders, they would claim, had killed over 100 men and carried away the bodies according to tribal custom, leaving only a handful of survivors to tell the tale. It was a story railroad officials were already predisposed to believe, and one that neatly explained why so few men remained. When the train finally pulled into the frozen valley, the railroad investigators found 18 gaunt men huddled in a supply shed. Hartwell, as erect and controlled as ever, told a story of siege and slaughter, of fighting bravely against an overwhelming enemy until rescue came too late. The officials, more concerned with restarting construction than probing deeply into the camp's suffering, accepted the explanation. Wilhelm Brenner, his cook tent scrubbed clean and his shelves stacked with smoked meat, explained the rations as the result of tireless hunting and strict rationing. His calm professionalism, so convincing during the early months of Camp 17, now masked the butcher he had become. But among the investigators was Harrison Vale, a company detective and former Union Army intelligence officer who had spent years interrogating prisoners. Vale listened, watched, and waited. He saw the cracks in their stories' details that didn't match dates, that shifted glances between men that spoke of conspiracy. So he separated them. He questioned them alone, pressing into the soft places of their minds where hunger and guilt had left them raw. One by one, the men of the outer circle broke. Through sobs and stammers came the truth of the killings, the stew, the roster, and the butcher's tent in the mountains. By the end of that day, the legend of an Indian raid had begun to unravel, revealing instead one of the most methodical nightmares in the history of America's westward expansion. Camp 17, buried for months under snow, would soon be buried again, this time under secrecy, shame, and a silence that would last for generations. The testimonies of the survivors shattered every assumption the investigators had brought with them. What they had expected to be a grim but understandable survival story turned out to be something far worse, a months-long campaign of murder and cannibalism organized with chilling precision. The final damning proof came from the discovery of Kazimierz Kowalski's hidden diary. Page after page revealed a systematic schedule of killings, the deliberate selection of victims, and detailed accounts of planning meetings, showing that these were not isolated acts of desperation, but a calculated system built on blood and flesh. The official investigation was wrapped up within 2 weeks of the supply train's arrival. What followed exposed the true priorities of Union Pacific and the industrial titans driving America's westward expansion. Instead of prosecuting over 100 counts of murder, company executives chose to bury the truth. They feared that exposure would cripple public trust and halt the flow of government subsidies that kept the railroad alive. The 18 survivors were quietly dispersed to isolated work sites across the Western Territories. Each man was forced to sign an agreement forbidding him from ever speaking about Camp 17, under threat of criminal prosecution for violating company secrets. Samuel Hartwell, the man who had overseen the slaughter, was rewarded. He received a promotion to a desk job in Omaha where he could be watched. Thomas Kincaid vanished from company records. Evidence suggests he was given enough money to start a new life in California, beyond the reach of journalists or courts. Wilhelm Brenner's fate was more elusive. Shipping records hint that a man of his description, carrying a fortune in cash, boarded a vessel for South America within weeks of the investigation's end. Almost certainly the company helped him escape. The families of the 109 dead workers each received a standardized letter. Their husbands, sons, or brothers, the letters claimed, had perished in accidents or Indian raids, casualties of a merciless winter. A modest payment accompanied each letter, enough to quiet questions, but never enough to repay a life. All official records of Camp 17 personnel files, telegraph supply manifests were systematically destroyed. The company erased the paper trail as efficiently as the men had burned the bodies. Kowalski, whose diary and testimony had exposed the truth, paid a terrible price. Officially, he suffered a complete mental collapse after the investigation and was committed to an asylum in Chicago. 3 years later, he died under suspicious circumstances. Whispers suggest he was poisoned to ensure that no one would ever again hear him speak of Camp 17. But Detective Harrison Vale, who had first uncovered the conspiracy, had already made copies of the diary and hidden them as insurance. His copy, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1889, remains the most complete account of the camp's descent into madness. Even the camp itself was wiped from the map. After the investigation, Union Pacific declared the site geologically unstable and abandoned it. Every building, every tool, every remnant of human presence was stripped away or destroyed with controlled explosions. By 1870, nothing remained. The location was erased from official maps and survey records, leaving only snow and stone where 109 men had been fed to the mountains and to each other. For all the Union Pacific's power, the psychological scars of Camp 17 could not be erased. Over the decades that followed, scattered survivors broke their silence, speaking of what they had endured in the mountains. Most were dismissed as madmen, their stories written off as fever dreams of frontier hardship or Indian warfare, rather than credible testimony of organized murder and cannibalism. Yet the pattern was unmistakable: unexplained deaths, sudden disappearances, and men who seemed to vanish just as their tongues loosened. The railroad's reach was long, and it made sure that Camp 17 stayed buried. It might have remained that way forever, if not for Margaret Hensley. In 1923, while combing through forgotten company files, the historian uncovered references to the camp that had somehow escaped the Great Purge of records. What she pieced together revealed not only the horrors of that winter, but the deliberate machinery of a corporate cover-up. She tried to publish, but Union Pacific's lawyers crushed her at every turn, citing trade secrets and national security. Her papers, found after her death in 1954, remain one of the few complete accounts of how ambition, negligence, and greed turned a work camp into a killing ground, and how those same forces buried the truth. Today, the site of Camp 17 lies beneath a reservoir built in the 1960s, the water hiding what the snow and dynamite could not. The tracks that claimed so many lives still cut through the Utah mountains, carrying freight for a company that has never once acknowledged the events of that winter. There are no markers, no apologies, and no mention of the 109 men who vanished into those frozen valleys. Camp 17 reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not born from legends. They are ordinary men stripped of food and hope, pressed into brutality by isolation and the cold calculus of institutions that value profit above human life. When corporations control the evidence and the narrative, justice can vanish as completely as a camp swallowed by snow and time. Do you think we know everything about what happened there? Or are there still secrets lying beneath the waters that cover Camp 17? Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you want more stories that explore the darkest corners of America's industrial past, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves a mystery. We'll see you next time. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.